When I was thinking about this speech, what do I feel about trade fairs? Well, firstly, I know that I feel enormously grateful to the organisers of this and its big sister, the Spring Fair, and Top Drawer, that the London gift fair, because my business was to an enormous extent forged in the forum, really, which is what this trade fair is. It's where I got to show my first ideas to a critical audience and to understand what the competition was that I was up against. It's a very dynamic and really quite a transformative atmosphere, potentially. So there you go. I hadn't really thought of it as that. I tended to think of it as very expensive and a massive time consumer. I hadn't realised that actually it was a very dynamic thing that had changed my life. It certainly changed my business. I'm going to start with a little bit about my business. I think most of you probably know, but I've been in business 30 years. That's a bit tricky because I have been wont to lie about my age a lot. A friend of my mother's once said, it's really good if you create a miasma of misinformation about your age. Nobody will ever know. They'll all be telling each other different ages. So for your information, I'm 45, okay? But that does mean that I started the business back in school, which I didn't quite. But it was just after I'd finished at university. I did I did about 18 months in a very creative company. And one of my strongest pieces of advice, not to you guys, but to young kids leaving school, leaving university, is just forget everything that the careers teacher tells you. Go and besiege the creative company that interests you until they give you a job, any job, doesn't matter in what capacity. I was a dog's body in a creative knitwear company where I learned so much. It was a fantastic experience. But fibbing about my age notwithstanding, I was bound to make quite an early start on my career because I grew up with an absolutely passionate desire to be financially independent. It's funny, I look back and I don't see it in my children, but it was very, very, very strong in me. And when I had the revelation in a china shop that the cups and saucers that I sought from my mum simply didn't exist, so I must make them myself, I think the important thing is, in a way, not what that idea was, but the tenacity with which I hung on to it. In the very excellent brief that Sophie gave me about talking to you today, she said, do put in some nuggets of helpful advice. It might not be, but I'll try out a few on you. And early on, one of the bits of advice that I was given, which has really stuck with me and it's always seemed true, is you can fret about an idea, about a decision. Have I made the right appointment? Have I got the collection right? Actually, don't sweat and try and sort of research your decision minutely. When you've got the idea, go for it. What matters is the tenacity of your follow-through. And I'm fairly sure that the only reason I'm still trading, still building my business 30 years on, is because I have an absolutely enormous tenacity. That idea in the china shop that I was going to make colourful mismatched china that was just right for my mum's kitchen was bang on. But it might have come to nothing had it not been for the blinding revelation that was my first visit to Stoke. I fervently hope you've all been to Stoke-on-Trent. It's a very, very marvellous place, unique and extraordinary. But I, aged 23, I guess I was when I first went there, hadn't been there before. I had no idea what the industrial Midlands looked like, and I was seriously gripped, amazed, shocked. I bounced across the city in a very stinky taxi. On my way I had one contact in the city, a model maker who I was told by an enthusiastic graphic designer friend in London might be just the person I needed to turn my idea of some mugs and jugs and bowls and dishes into a reality. So I was on my way to see him. And the taxi skittled through the city, which is like our own small, very English version of Detroit. It's got some really very, very big problems as a result of losing not just its pottery industry to a large extent, but also coal and steel. I learned recently there were 22 pit heads in Stoke-on-Trent and its sister city, Newcastle-under-Lyme. 22 coal mines actually in the city. So it's small wonder that it looks quite, it's pretty flaky. There's an awful lot of demolition still 30 years on. And that presents all kinds of problems. I could feel this strong sense of a spirit of past greatness, and I was immensely romanced by that right away. The feeling of real greatness, real skills and traditions absolutely still imbues the city. And I was completely struck, and I know it's what completely changed my life. It's what fired me on to keep going. But when I got to Sam's, when I got to his fairly sort of rundown shed, if I tell you the address was Chemical Lane, I probably don't need to tell you much more about it. But my Lord, it was a fantastically creative place for me. And what I realised there was that I didn't worry about the look of the place. What I'd stumbled into was an incredible resource of skills. And his small workforce, I think at the time he probably employed about 17 people. There they were. They absolutely know how to make Staffordshire pottery, and they were doing it to the most beautiful standards. It mattered not that what they were making at the time was a very sort of quotidian mixture that he had tenaciously sort of found. He was making whiskey miniatures with all the clan tartans beautifully painted on, little 3-inch Scotsmen with holes in their heads and little corks, and pub ashtrays and planters for garden centres. You know, it wasn't what he was making that inspired me, it was the way they were making it. And I realised that in his shed, with his very cheery team, I could make this idea that had gripped me of colourful pottery, I could make it real. And those cups would actually come about that I wanted for my mum. And I think I sort of recently really realised that those values, the value that people put on their skills and traditions in Stoke, that's my great good fortune to have stumbled on that. That very thing that was being reckoned as too expensive, out of date, not worth having, that many factories were setting aside in favour of finding cheaper ways of manufacturing in the Far East. That's the very thing that's given life and love and significance, I think, to what I make. So I am eternally grateful to and moved by Stoke and its people. And that's it brings me really to another useful nugget of information, I hope, which is that you're much more likely to feel tenaciously gripped onto your project if it's something you feel passionate about. It's very, very difficult to keep going. That's something I do believe if I had taken the sort of prevailing advice at the time and gone abroad, I probably would have lost the plot by now. I know that it's the real desire to see change and to bring young people into the industry and to keep the industry going. That's what's fired me along. And happily, I married a man who felt exactly the same. Matthew. When Matthew Rice is my husband, when we got married, we got engaged just 10 weeks after our first date, a lot of my bemused friends and family said, "Good Lord, where do you find a man like Matthew? One who can run up a risotto out of a roadkill pheasant and some apparent weeds out of the garden and a packet of old rice, who's got this huge repertoire of show songs, who can make a kitchen garden effortlessly, and who is such a crack designer? Well, the answer has to be, ladies and gentlemen, at a trade fair. I met him at Top Drawer. So switch off your phones and prowl the aisles carefully. You don't need Tinder. It's all happening here, potentially. He and I were very hands-on putting up our stands. And often we're here, the show itself is a very, very full and busy 5 days. We'd have had a full and exhausting 5 days putting up our elaborate stands before the show opened. And so it did very much feel like home here. And this is kind of the only happens to Matthew. He was busy graffitiing his stand. I think he was having a phase of writing a lot of cheeky sort of chirpy instructions all over his stand, when a squirrel dashed past. And rather than just going, "Oh," and letting it go on, he thought, "I better catch it." And he managed to corner it on someone's stand, and it bit him quite badly, and he was bleeding hard. So he rushed off, with me just entirely annoyed and indifferent, to find a nurse. And after she bandaged him up, he said, "Gosh, I bet that doesn't happen often, that people get bitten by wildlife here." And she went, "Well, actually, last week we had a lady in who had a camel bite her on the bottom." So other exciting things might be happening here as well. Another small nugget of advice: name tags. Do, please, you visitors, display them prominently. Otherwise, you'll wonder why we're staring at your bosoms, because it's got underneath a scarf and your coat. That's really important. You can forget all the other advice. Because I've never had anything but clarity that I want to make our pottery in Stoke-on-Trent, the question of export has it's not been prominent enough in our thinking until quite recently. But it's the other half of my complete conviction that you must make in Britain. We must go on manufacturing here. And there's so much we can do with our traditions and skills. But I'm not advocating a sort of, can we go somehow back to the Satanic Mills? I think that we need to take the good stuff from the past and do forward-looking things with industry here. I think that's what we're good at. We innovate, we're good at design. But for us, making on a small scale, it was hard to build export in because it's quite low margin. And what we really like is when someone comes to the factory, shops like mad in the first shop, loads it up into her own car and drives it home for herself. That's our best. That's a marvellous sell for us. Whereas by the time we've got the wares onto the shelves of a shop in Manhattan, the returns for us are very small. But as we get bigger, we can start to build that in. So my sort of excuse for not having as yet built to more than, we're just something over 10% export. We turn over about 15 million, and it's only really that small amount. And in the past, Stoke, I think as much as 60% of the output of the city was for export. So that's I'm sure it's fluctuated and different factories will have been doing different rates, but we've always been aware that there are possibilities that we haven't really addressed. So we all know that. I remember sort of dimly from history at school, O-level, 19th century stuff, that we'd had a great booming industrial past, and that had helped us create an enormously powerful economy. And if you think about it, that 60% of wares that were being exported from Stoke, that added up to this enormous thing over the 200 years or so of the industry. That equates to the creation cumulatively of millions of jobs, huge entrepreneurial wealth, and a flowing river of lovely lolly into the treasury at any given time. And that situation still holds. We do need that wealth that actually making things. There's no substitute for it economically. So we have to all think about it. And most of you, I guess, are here as buyers. And so I would say, if you consider, when you support a British brand, it's about the most political thing you do. And I am incredibly strongly aware that the raft of independent shops, we have around 400 independent stockists in the UK at any given time. And you have been fantastic supporters of the brand, of the company, and of the factory in Stoke, for which I am fantastically grateful. And I know that one of the possibilities here is for companies to build the kind of relationships with their stockists, whereby the stockists know, understand, appreciate what you do, and help put that message out there to your customers, to their customers, and that's exactly the kind of conversation. Well, that's the result of the conversations that go on the stands here. It's a very, very sort of important part of building the business. And if I ever forget about our sort of our great industrial past, there's a marvellous way in which it comes back to remind you. Wherever you go in the world, there are traces. Just before the trouble hit, Matthew and I were in Damascus. To my amazement, we found a stall in the souk selling Staffordshire spongeware from the 19th century. When you travel in America, in a sort of incredibly far distant place in the sandhills, you find a yard sale and someone's selling willow pattern made in Stoke-on-Trent. We were in Nevis in the Caribbean, and all amongst the tangled creepers, there was this wonderful, wonderful decayed, huge sculpture of rusty engineering from with a Birmingham engineer's name on it. You can't forget it. You stumble on it all the time. We did send an enormous amount of wonderful stuff out into the world, and I'm really interested in trying to make contact with the confidence of that, because I think one of the things we have lacked when it comes to export is a feeling of sure confidence that people want us. We need to develop a really resilient and chirpy kind of a feeling of that people want to get out, want us to come out and show them our things. Because since the 70s, the 1970s, that manufacturing tradition really has waned very badly. The tide's reversed. And there is this very uninhibited desire to buy imported goods. And I fully understand that is part of the economy, but I just think we absolutely have to keep trying to keep in mind the virtue, the value, and from my point of view, the enormous fun of making for ourselves as well. And the truth is, dealing with export customers is difficult in the kind of hurly-burly of getting your company started. And so you do need to, the Chambers of Commerce are terrific. What we found was a way of cracking our reluctance to get into export was to use the local Chambers of Commerce, who just pour the most wonderful resource of information and enthusiasm your way. I'm very keen to take questions. I've just got one thing, last thing I want to say, which is that I think for me there was a reluctance to address export, also because of a slight confusion in my mind as to what people actually think of my brand and of Britain. And I felt for ages rather sort of handicapped by the idea of an old Englishness, and it seemed too often that was what people were trying to export, was something rather quaint and sort of some strange mix of beefeaters and scones and cottages and stuff. Not that those aren't all things I like very much indeed, but I don't want to be associated with a sort of backward-looking, nostalgic thing. And I don't know about you guys, but for us, 2012 was an absolute game changer. There was a wonderful feeling then that we'd found our mojo. We didn't need to pretend. We didn't need to pretend that we were great. It was absolutely obvious, and we said it with such good humour, and it was so obviously rapturously received by the rest of the world. And we have been trying to build on that feeling of a humorous and much kindlier take on the past.